Okay, so we were talking in class about the biotic and abiotic factors that affect life, and specifically we were talking about the biotic and abiotic factors that affect a flower. Now, we mentioned that flowers know when to bloom based on a variety of things, like, for example, the temperature and also the length of, actually, they pay attention to the length of the night. And the reason that they even care about trying to bloom at a specific time is so that they can maintain this big idea that we've had all this time, so that they can maintain homeostasis. Because some of the things that we need to keep in mind that we learned about in last unit when it comes to homeostasis is we need to pay attention to the energy needs of a living thing and also to the matter that a living thing needs to be able to absorb in order to survive. So if you are a plant and you want to flower, you're actually engaging in this very costly event. You're going to create lots of new cells. And that's going to require lots of matter like water and carbon dioxide and all kinds of things. It's also going to require lots of energy. And so you want to time that at a period when you're going to get the biggest benefit. And so for a flower, typically you've got a time during the year when there's lots of energy and lots of available matter. That would be spring, when the days are just warming up and the sun is out a lot more. And this is a time when plants have lots of excess energy, and so it's the perfect time for them to bloom. On the other hand, if you were to bloom in the middle of winter, there's probably not a lot of sunlight. There's not necessarily a lot of water available, especially in certain parts of the world. And so that's going to keep you from actually wanting to bloom. And so plants are constantly trying to balance this, find the right time of year that they're going to make that big investment of creating flowers and trying to reproduce, and they judge that based on biotic and abiotic factors. Mostly, they're judging it based on abiotic factors, like we're seeing here, based on temperature and night length. Now, these abiotic and biotic factors do not affect all organisms the same way. Take, for example, this plant, which is called the Christmas cactus. It's sort of a cactus, not really. It's kind of related. But the big deal about the Christmas cactus is that it blooms right around Christmas in the middle of winter. And the question might be, why does it choose to bloom at this time? Well, it's going to be based on a lot of things. It's going to be based on both biotic and abiotic factors. So first of all, one of the reasons it's better for the Christmas cactus to bloom in the middle of the winter is that it is going to have the most access to water. In the deserts where it lives, it may only rain a little bit, and that rain only occurs maybe during the middle of winter. Also, a plant that is trying to do photosynthesis and trying to grow is going to always lose water. And the hotter it is, the more water you lose. So in order to avoid water loss, many desert plants actually do not really do any photosynthesis or hardly any photosynthesis at all during the summer. So even though there's a lot of sun, they don't want to lose water by trying to do these things. So in order to conserve water, the Christmas cactus does this during the winter when the days are cooler. And that's another abiotic factor, is the actual temperature that's involved in winter compared to the temperature that's extremely high during the summer in these places where the Christmas cactus survives. Another issue is the biotic factors. Most desert animals are affected by those same abiotic issues, and so they're much more active during the winter. So animals are active during the winter. And for the Christmas cactus, pollination occurs by some combination of just wind pollination and also by birds are really the common pollinators in the desert. Think of the hummingbird, for example. And so the Christmas cactus is an example of evolution where the organism has actually evolved to take advantage of the specific biotic and abiotic factors that it deals with that may be different from another environment. And one of the things that we want to focus on is that's related to just flowers, but of course biotic and abiotic factors are important to other things. So if we think on just sort of the cellular level, we can look at these yeast cells and we can think about the biotic and abiotic factors that affect this yeast. Now one thing you'll notice is this yeast is actually reproducing. You can see it's budding. Here is one baby yeast cell that is just budded off of a larger yeast cell. And that's how yeast reproduces, is by basically splitting into two different, essentially identical cells. And so if we think about the biotic and the abiotic factors that affect this, one of the biotic factors that is always going to affect cells is what we call cell density. So that's just how many cells are in the area. And if you look at this graph, this kind of gives us a good idea. We're growing graph on a petri dish here and counting basically how much yeast is there for each hour. So we start off with a very little bit of yeast at the beginning, and for the first part, we have what's called exponential growth. This is essentially doubling. So you're getting about twice as much yeast for 1 hour as you are for the next hour. And so this is a really fast growth of the population. That's because there's very little yeast and there's a lot of resources. So this is marked by high resources, and there's also low competition because since there's so little other yeast trying to eat up the food that's available, there's lots of food for each individual cell, and that leads to really rapid growth. Now at some point, the amount of yeast gets so high that they start basically eating up all of their food, and so the rate of population increase starts to decrease until you get to kind of this maximum value. And that maximum value is what's called the carrying capacity of that environment. And the carrying capacity is this point where the population has become big enough that it has maximized the resources available. Any more yeast would actually starve to death because there's not enough food for them. And this is true of not just yeast, but really all populations. All populations reach this kind of maximum size, and the amount of the carrying capacity is going to be determined by biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic factors like how much water is there in the environment and how much sunlight for energy, and biotic factors like how much food is available, and also what kind of predators are you dealing with. Predators might bring the population down, for example. So that was a biotic factor that yeast deal with. They're affected by how many other yeast are around, for example. If it gets too crowded, then their population growth rate is going to slow down. Small organisms like this Daphnia, which is actually a multicellular, it's like a very tiny little shrimp, is affected by certain abiotic factors. And one of those abiotic factors that can affect is temperature. And Daphnia is a good example of this. You can actually do a little experiment, which is what's shown here, where you look at Daphnia under a microscope and just count their heartbeats at different temperatures. And what we find out is that as you raise the temperature, the Daphnia's heart beats faster and faster and faster. And this is going to be true of all organisms. As things warm up, their body actually becomes more efficient. And they do metabolism, which is like creating energy, cellular respiration, faster. Until they reach a certain point. Now, at this peak temperature, this is like as efficient as you can be. You're making the most possible energy, or you're converting energy as quickly as possible. Now, if you go over that temperature, you'll notice that the rate of the heartbeat starts to drop really fast. And that's because what happens is at this point, where you've gone over the maximum temperature, is now the enzymes, or the different proteins that control those reactions. You might think of ATP synthase, for example, is an enzyme we learned about before. Those enzymes become denatured. Which means basically they break. And so if these enzymes start breaking down because it's too hot, then you're not able to do cellular respiration anymore. And very quickly, as the temperature increases, your metabolism drops off, and it's going to reach a point. If it gets a little bit hotter, you're actually just going to, the Daphnia will all just die because their enzymes have been completely destroyed. And so temperature is an important abiotic factor that all things deal with. They have to be in a certain temperature range in order to survive. If the temperature increases, then their metabolism increases up to a certain point, and then it becomes dangerous. If the temperature decreases, their metabolism slows. And this is why a lot of organisms like humans actually actively control their body temperature. Humans make sure that we maintain our body temperature always right at the very peak so that we are constantly as efficient as possible. If we get a little bit warmer than that, bad things happen, we die. If we get a little bit colder than that, bad things happen and we die. So we have this very narrow range of homeostasis. All right. Now, so we've looked at organisms like flowers and the abiotic and biotic factors that affect them. We've also looked at cells and the biotic and abiotic factors that affect them. We also can look at the biotic and abiotic factors involved in entire ecosystems. So this would be like an American Plains ecosystem. You can see that we've got these different levels. Down here you've got the producers, which are the plants, like the grasses are really important in the American West. Grass is a producer. And then here you've got the consumers. Here, let me write that, producer. And here you've got the consumer, or what we often call the primary consumer, because these guys actually eat the producers. And then above them you have what are called secondary consumers, because secondary consumers consume the consumers. And at each level, there's going to be a variety of biotic and abiotic factors that are affecting those organisms. And so, for example, if you're a deer, right, you're going to be affected by biotic factors like wolves. The number of wolves is going to affect the number of deer. You're also affected by biotic factors like the amount of grass, right? So those are both biotic factors that are going to affect you. You're also affected by abiotic factors like how much water is there. Water availability is a big thing. Temperature. If it gets too cold during the winter, you could freeze to death. If it gets too hot, you could die of dehydration or heat stroke. You also have to be concerned with things like the amount of sunlight. That doesn't affect the deer directly, but it does affect the amount of grass. And if the grass starts to die off, that's obviously going to kill off the deer. And so in ecosystems, we see that there's usually this kind of ripple effect, we call it, where if you change one part of the ecosystem, it's going to change the other parts through a variety of biotic and abiotic interactions. One of the classic examples of this is something we learned really recently, and I think it surprised a lot of people, is if you look at specifically the American West, right, there's lots of grass, lots of deer, lots of wolves, things like that. When when Westerners first arrived, humans were already here in the form of Native Americans. And as Westerners kind of took over the West, there was one organism in particular we really liked. We really liked deer. These guys. And the reason we liked deer was because we could go out and hunt deer. And a lot of people thought that was fun, and they enjoyed eating the meat. And so we wanted to have lots of deer. Okay, it was just an economic necessity. It just made money to have deer because you could charge the hunters to go hunting, and then the state would make money. And so the states planned out, how can we get the most number of deer? What should we do? And what do you think they thought of? Well, they looked around, they looked at the ecosystem, and they saw that wolves eat deer, and so they said, well, we'll get rid of the wolves. And there was this campaign where humans went around and actively hunted and killed wolves because they thought it would increase the size of the deer population. And that makes sense unless you know a lot about biology. Because think about what happened. All of a sudden, you ended up with a situation where you had lots and lots and lots of deer. And what happened was all of these deer, they were not in the ecosystem by themselves. They were affecting the rest of the ecosystem. And so they started eating lots and lots and lots of grass. And the grass population declined very quickly. So all of a sudden, you've got lots of deer. Oops, that's lost. Let's try that again. All of a sudden, you've got lots of deer, and now you have very little grass because the deer have eaten it all up. Now, what do you think happened to the deer? Well, the deer population crashed, and in fact, deer almost went extinct. We almost completely ran out of certain species of deer because there was so little food for them because they had overeaten it. And so it turns out that the wolves were actually balancing the whole system, keeping it in homeostasis. The wolves would eat just enough deer each year so that the deer didn't overeat their food source, and every single organism could survive. We call this top-down control. And we've discovered that this is really common in a lot of ecosystems, where if you take the big top predator out, it actually damages the population of all the other organisms, which is not what we thought 100 years ago. We thought if you take away the wolves, the deer are just going to run crazy, and that's true to an extent, but long term, it doesn't work that way. And that's why there are now campaigns to return wolves to the West, and also it's why humans actually need to go out and, to some extent, fill the role that wolves were taking, and actually go out and hunt and kill deer, because the wolves aren't there to do it anymore. And it's actually in the best interest of the environment as a whole if something is killing off a certain amount of the deer. And that's, of course, a very delicate balance. It's what we like to call homeostasis.